Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Pat Hagan. I'm serving as the project director for this governance assessment. I'm working with RSM. With me today as a co-presenter is Steve Mermelstein, who's also with RSM and serves as our national, state, and local government consulting leader. The purpose of today's webinar is to seek community and public input to help VTA enhance its board governance. To that end, we've got a pretty extensive and robust agenda for your discussion. We've got the table of contents that shows the variety of different topics that we'll cover today. We'll start by taking you through the project background, scope, and methodology. We'd like to highlight some of the communications and outreach efforts that we've undertaken to date. And we've got some analysis, including national transportation research and some of the benchmark agencies that we've selected for review. So first, in section 1, we want to step back and talk a little bit about why is VTA undertaking this governance study and what work is being done by RSM as part of this process. For those of you that aren't familiar with VTA, we've included a slide number 6 that gives a brief summary of some of the organizational facts. And one of the unusual attributes about VTA is it has multiple modal, we call them, responsibilities. So many of you are familiar with bus and light rail as VTA riders, but VTA also has responsibility for operating some of the highway express lanes, bike and pedestrian paths, and a broader congestion management and countywide planning responsibility within the county. Additionally, VTA is one of 27 different transit providers in the Bay Area. They partner with a number of other agencies that you might be familiar with, including Caltrain and others. With regard to VTA's size, they have an operating budget of about $500 million and about 2,000 people. The board is comprised of 12 members and 6 alternates and 3 ex officio, which means non-voting members. And these members are representing the 16 jurisdictions countywide, and they're all elected officials. The next slide describes our background and the purpose of the governance study. The current board chair established governance as a priority for her 2019 term. Following that, the ad hoc board enhancement committee, which we'll call the BEC, was established. RSM was engaged to perform an independent and unbiased study. We've been working on this effort since August, and we expect to have a wrap-up and conclusion by mid-December. At this point, we've made a number of public presentations, and we've also presented to the BEC in a public forum 4 times. At this point, please note that what we'll provide today for your input is not final and is subject to some change and update as we proceed. The overall objectives are listed on the right-hand side of slide 7. Part of this process is what we're doing today is seeking input from key stakeholders in the public. As we mentioned, we'll do some benchmarking and looking at national leading practices with the overall goal of our report and deliverable is to to provide some performance and effectiveness options and recommendations. So let's talk about why is VTA assessing its board governance. Some of the key themes that we've discussed and that have come up during our preliminary work are just some facts that are identified here. VTA's board composition was created over 28 years ago when VTA was created out of the Congestion Management Agency and ultimately from Santa Clara County. The board structure and governance structure is relatively unique. We'll talk a little bit more about how VTA compares to some of the benchmark agencies. And then probably, as we all know, in Santa Clara County, it's one of the fastest growing counties in California and is also among the nation's most congested urbanized areas. The board has, from a governance perspective, addressed recently some significant issues, the BART project, the overall VTA budget, and some route changes. And then governance at VTA is complicated by the number of other transportation providers that we refer to that are operating in the 9-county Bay Area. Looking at the scope on slide 9, overall, we wanted to just remind everyone that we're not looking at individual VTA board decisions or individual cities, projects, or grants. And this is also not an operations or management review. This is about governance. Some of the studies that we're looking at include organizational reports by prior consultants. Also, the California State Auditor General issued a report that looked at governance amongst other areas. And then the Santa Clara County Civil Grand Jury has issued several reports. The most recent one was out several months ago, and many of the participating cities as well as VTA have responded to that. The scope areas on the right-hand side of slide 9 are those that are typically reviewed in a governance project. We're looking broadly at how the board selects its members, what the average size of VTA's board is contrasted with others, things like the term length, the meeting frequency, and the committee structure. Most importantly, the bottom 3 or 4 bullets relate to how well does the VTA board set ratings, how do they assess themselves, and what measures are there for improving efficiency and effectiveness. The next slide is some project challenges, and these are just informational. We'll talk a little bit about some of these further as we go, but what we found as we've started looking at this process is that there really have been limited studies on transportation governance. And as a matter of fact, one of the ones that we quote there by the Transportation Research Board had a specific reference to the fact that there is no universal formula for what transit boards should look like or how they should function. And that makes sense when you think about it, because VTA is unique in terms of operating in this region and with its multimodal responsibilities. Additionally, VTA has limited peers from an operational perspective and just in terms of pure size and the breadth of responsibility. And then lastly, part of the process will be after we report our results to the Board Enhancement Committee, they will accept or modify and take recommendations forward to the board overall, which would need to achieve consensus. The last bullet refers to the way that our recommendations will be provided. We expect to make some recommendations that would be simply able to be enacted through policy changes. We'll have a second tier of recommendations that might require changes to what VTA calls its administrative code that could be voted on by the board. And then lastly, and potentially most challenging, would be any changes that would be required to the actual state enabling legislation.
Thanks, Pat. So as you can imagine, as we've mentioned, as we've set this up, the relative challenge to this, we want to bring a methodology to this as RSM, and bring a plan to tackle this as an engagement. Our objective is to bring, as a third party, is to bring an unbiased, independent diagnostic evaluation, so that we can really assess and help the board find initiatives that will lead to improved governance and ultimately mission and vision achievement. Essentially, the high-level method that we bring is through this concept of discovery, analysis, and roadmap. In many cases, the roadmap may be referred to as the final report. But essentially what we're trying to do is begin with a discovery period where we learn and understand a lot about the existing processes, the existing policies, the existing procedures, et cetera, how the board operates currently. We are then doing a variety of analysis, which we're going to describe in a few slides. We perform a variety of analyses so that we can understand how to leverage that, compare against leading practices. That includes as well, talking with board members, talking with, in some cases, even former board members, talking with board secretaries from other agencies. There's a variety of perspectives that we want to bring so that we can have a holistic view as we provide this assessment. Ultimately, we provide a roadmap report of our recommendations that the board will take into consideration. To the right side of slide 11, what you see, we often help implement recommendations and help ultimately create continuous improvement through further optimization down the road. Those particular implement and optimize steps are not part of this scope. So to take this a little bit further, RSM's board governance framework helps boards aim at becoming a high-performing group and a high-performing team with the concept of continuous improvement. And these particular fundamentals, as you see on slide 12, describe the areas that we are assessing along the way: strategy, innovation, and future vision, board capabilities and structure, accountability, engagement, policies, procedures, and communications, and ultimately performance monitoring. And these are all very interrelated, as well as they, when you're really working on these in a high performing manner, you know, the idea is not to do this just one time, but over time, that you continuously improve and continuously review as you make improvements in your governance activities. From a work stream perspective, in terms of kind of digging in further into the activities we've been performing, we will describe a little bit further some of the current state analysis we are doing. We are comparing against leading practices from both other public entities as well as private entities, private industry, taking some of those leading practices into consideration. As mentioned, we're conducting board interviews. We've been conducting surveys as well to gather information. We're benchmarking across other transportation agencies from around the country. We're going to describe that a little bit. We've been leveraging national transportation and corporate research, providing community and stakeholder outreach, such as public meetings, even this webcast, other opportunities for the public to submit input and feedback via the VTA website. We've done some testing of compliance in terms of some of the requirements by the Enabling Act and other guidelines in which VTA is supposed to be performing. So we've done that activity. And then over time, over the course of this project, we have been reporting our progress to the board through various meetings, the board and enhancement committees meetings that Pat has referred to.
Thank you, Steve. I'll go back and continue on section 2, communications. Here we want to talk about what outreach efforts have been undertaken during the process of this governance assessment. Specifically with regard to communications on slide 15, we identify a number of the different areas that we've been seeking, and many members of the public and community have been providing feedback. We appreciate that very much. We've also, in addition to that, made some presentations to VTA's Policy Advisory Committee and the Citizens Advisory Committee. And we've also met with the Cities Association of Santa Clara County, as well as the city managers. The next section begins to get into some of the national transportation research that we've undertaken. The real question was here whether there's any national best practices with regard to governance that VTA could consider or adopt. Slide 17 shows some of the sources that we've looked at for this information. These include some of the well-known industry associations, such as the American Public Transportation Association, known as APTA. Also, we'll refer to some studies that have been done by the Transportation Research Board. And then we've reached out and spoken with the Mineta Transportation Institute here in San Jose. In addition to those public sector sources, we've researched the National Association of Corporate Directors for some private sector best practices. The relevant studies we've considered, besides the ones that I mentioned, also include some information from the Federal Transit Administration called the National Transit Database. The next couple slides are just really summaries of some of our research, and this first one is called Public Transit System Boards, Organization and Characteristics. And this was a bit of a benchmark study that was done because there were 254 responses received from a variety of different transportation and transit agencies across the country. Some of the primary objectives of this study were to identify the board powers, roles, responsibility, and size. And some of the topics included areas such as the selection method for board members, the length of the term, new member orientation, and ultimately, again, ways to measure board effectiveness. The second model that we looked at, a report that we looked at, is called Transforming Public Sector Institutional and Business Models, also issued by the Transportation Research Board. And the purpose of this was a little bit more to look at change management In other words, how can organizations sustain success, in this case, success with governance? And as part of this, the research board looked at 14 different case studies. And what they concluded and reported on was that there's a variety of different drivers for change, some of which are applicable to VTA. And those include things like funding and finance, different technology, demographics and societal changes, and travel and land use patterns. On the right-hand side of the slide, some of the themes of successful change were things like having strong collaboration, having a clear vision established by the board, having stable and supportive leadership to then execute that vision, and even considering realigning some agency authorities within the region with other organizations. Section 4 now begins to get into some of the benchmark agencies, and the purpose of looking at these was to determine what could be learned from other similar complex transportation agencies. On slide 21, we've identified 6 different organizations. The important note here is that we picked these because they intentionally have varying governance models. They also are similar to VTA in that they serve multiple jurisdictions and they operate at different modes. So just briefly, we'll hit some of the highlights. LA Metro, as an example, was interesting to us because they have 87 cities in LA County, and they actually provide some board members to LA Metro through a selection committee process. A different model exists in Chicago at the Chicago Transit Authority, where the 7 representatives are appointed by the Chicago mayor and the Illinois governor. And another different model exists in Denver at the Regional Transportation District, where the members are directly elected. So we were taking some best practices and contrasting that to how VTA's governance structure works. Section 5 is areas of analysis, and here we'd like to discuss with you a little bit about what analysis has been done to date. So slide 23 has a summary of a number of different areas. We'll report on these in our final deliverable to the Board Enhancement Committee. These include things like the different committee structures that VTA has and how they operate. We're also taking a look at the Enabling Act, which means the legislation that was established by the California legislature, and then also the Administrative Code, which is how VTA implements and establishes policies and procedures for its daily operations. We also further took a look at how VTA is complying with its own policies and is examining areas such as meeting attendance, public noticing, and quorums. On the bottom diamonds, these depict the areas that we're looking at, including strategies and priorities. We're going to compare those against some of the other benchmark agencies that we discussed. We've done some analysis of population, sales tax, and ridership for each of the cities within the VTA service area. And we've also benchmarked again to some of the National Transit Database statistics that are available from the FTA. Section 6 is timelines and milestones. So this is really intended to give everyone a sense of when RSM's work is expected to be complete. On slide 25, we've got a summary and just a few highlights here. The BEC, the Board Enhancement Committee meetings, you can see depicted. We'll have 5 of those, and the next one is here on site at VTA on December 20th. At this point, we just wanted to conclude the timeline by saying that this concludes RSM's work, but our recommendations will be reported to the committee, and the committee may have additional deliberations and may take the full recommendations to the board before there's an implementation plan established and released. So that really concludes our prepared comments on section 7. We're really at this point seeking your questions or input. Please, if you do provide any feedback either online or elsewhere, remember that we're really looking for comments and input relating to the governance study. If you've got any other comments or feedback for VTA separately about their operations or other topics, we've identified the customer service line here that you may call. And then also, if you'd like to provide comments or feedback after this meeting, there's an online website landing page that we've provided the link to, as well as a dedicated voicemail line. So thank you in advance for participating and for any questions that you may have. And at this point, we'll open it for questions.
Pat, here's a couple of common questions maybe that you might be able to tackle. In terms of board cooperation, as you mentioned, we've been chatting with the board and interviewing with them. How would you gauge the relative cooperation?
The board's been very engaged in this process, and we've had a great dialogue and great feedback. We also, as we mentioned, we have issued a board survey, which is a very comprehensive survey to all the members of the board, and we've completed interviews. I believe that between the board survey and the interviews, we've spoken to over 15 different board members. So we appreciate that input.
One question about the enabling legislation. What would that be? Can you talk a little bit about what the enabling legislation is?
Sure. The enabling legislation is the legislation that was created by the lawmakers in Sacramento in about 1994. And that is what established the VTA as a transit organization. So the history of VTA is that initially some of the mass transit, the bus and rail, was run by Santa Clara County. There was also a separate congestion management agency that was established with region-wide planning responsibilities. This legislation pulled those together, created this separate authority called the Santa Clara Valley Transportation Authority, and vested within it other responsibilities that we've discussed, including highway operation and regional planning.
Would the board have any opportunity, I guess really, if for the changes that we make, would the board be able to introduce the legislation, or could there be an opportunity to go directly to legislators to start to introduce that?
I think first the board would have to reach some consensus on the recommendations, and there's probably a different process that's a bit outside of the scope of this work, Steve, that would include vetting those recommendations with the participating cities and others. And if there were consensus there, I think that then there would be some component of drafting potential legislation. But that process is not fully defined at this point in time, and is probably would certainly occur after we deliver our results and after the VTA board debates and discusses and accepts some of those recommendations.
Can you describe the touch points we've had with mayors or city council?
Yes, and we've had some good feedback from those, so appreciate that question as well. We've been to the Cities Association meeting, which is comprised of elected officials from the participating jurisdictions. We'll probably go back and report to them when this process is done. Additionally, we've met with the City Managers Association, and those are individuals that are responsible, obviously, for operations daily at all of the cities in the region here.